Hey, folks, you're listening to the Jobs Podcast, and I am your host, Tim Hendricks. Today we have Erik with us. Erik is an audio engineer, and he also owns Viking Guitar Productions. He does mixing and mastering and audio, and the guy is a savant when it comes to quality sound and mixing. And I'm really glad we've got this cool profession on today. Erik, thanks for joining me.
Of course, you were wonderful to invite me, and even more generous to leave the word idiot out of idiot savant earlier. So I appreciate all of that.
Well, I try and build up my guests and make them feel good when they're done. So let's start off like we always do. Give us a little bit of an origin story of where Erik was born and upbringing, early influences, and kind of how you first got into maybe this is going to be my career path.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Bay Area, California, good old Santa Cruz, where The Lost Boys was filmed and all that stuff. So I, grew up in Surf City, USA, basically in the late 80s and 90s. And in my teenage years, like many people do, I discovered the wonders of heavy metal and got way into that and started playing guitar. And that kind of was the real jumping off point for all of this. And I was in various bands and pursuing various musical projects. And somewhere around maybe 2001, 2002, I wanted to start recording my own stuff. And, the technology was rapidly evolving around that time, but obviously isn't where it is today. So there was a few years of me kind of figuring out different processes. I was, 17, 18 at the time, didn't have a ton of money to spend on this. So it's not like I could just go, do an internship somewhere or something. And, um, so it was something I just kind of got more and more into. It started as a way for me to get down my musical ideas to more efficiently share them with people I was collaborating with. And then as the the inevitable disillusion with trying to have a successful band continued to dawn on me.
Yeah.
I started looking at it more from a standpoint of, well, why don't I just do this on my own and put out albums on my own? And that's really where things went. I started learning how to do it and got better at it. And in the community I was doing music in, other people started to like the sound of what I was doing and hired me to do their production. And it just grew from there. And today I spend about half of my time doing mixing and or mastering for various hard rock and metal bands, particularly within this niche community of video game cover bands
Sure.
and video game composers and stuff, which is something I've done for a long time. And the other half is doing voiceover and narration. Just as a function of doing audio stuff, I somehow fell into that and ended up getting some traction with it. And there's a weekly horror fiction podcast I host and narrate for called Horror Hill. And in addition to that, I have a few YouTube channels I do, a few other projects, finishing up an audiobook right now. It's nice. So I actually had to relocate out of California because the cost of living outpaced me, as has happened to a number of people out there.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm in Rochester, New York these days. My wife and I are living in a wonderful little suburban area with our stupid cat, and I get to spend my whole day listening to heavy metal and reading horror stories, and it's kind of a dream, actually.
That's kind of a shift going from the West Coast to Rochester, New York. Was that a hard? It's a pretty different environment, I would think. Was that you fell right into that, or was that kind of a culture shock?
No one can leave the vast selection of amazing Mexican food in the Bay Area and
Yeah, I know.
and consider anything a smooth transition.
Yeah.
It's fine. It took a bit of getting used to. I managed to. I was very lucky living in Santa Cruz in a lot of ways because it's one of the most temperate climates in the world. It has a lot of entertainment and all this other stuff, and good food, as I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And getting out here and having actual seasons and, the impacts on life surrounding that, it took a bit of getting used to. And I'd moved to Pittsburgh for about a year to try that out. I had some friends there, and Pittsburgh's a great place, but it wasn't a good fit for me. And I moved up here. And little did I know on the front end that it was going to go how it did, because I was planning on moving the last week of March 2020. And there was some stuff going on in March of 2020.
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit.
So got up here and immediately quarantine hit, and I feel that was the right thing, of course, but it turned into me being in the house up here in a new area without anyone I knew, except my then girlfriend, now wife, for about a year before anything started to normalize a bit. So it's impossible for me to say if my experience was indicative of how it normally goes, but it
Sure.
certainly was a transition.
Let's go back to when you were learning kind of how to do the mixing and what what was your process? Were you just self-learning and you were on forums? The internet was around then. You were maybe on some message boards or on YouTube and just kind of self-taught, experimenting, failing and succeeding and over and over again? Or was there like an online program that you purchased or an online course, or how did that all kind of transpire?
It was a lot of self-directed learning, and I had a few opportunities for some shadowing and stuff like that too. It's interesting with audio in particular. It's a field where it's very easy for people online to claim to be experienced at it or have knowledge, like I'm doing right now, actually.
Well,
and um, the unfortunate thing is that due to the nature of audio, the fact that every listening experience is very subjective and it's determined by the equipment you're listening on and the environment you're listening in and all that stuff, it's very easy for bad information to proliferate. And so I probably spent as much time buying into BS and then slowly disproving it to myself over time as I did learning actual tangible good things. Um, Something that was, well, stepping back even a bit more, in about 2004, 2005, I was recording some stuff of my own for the first time, doing an album on my own. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I mean, I could get sound into my computer, and that was the first hurdle, and I was happy with that. But the process I kind of jerry rigged together was so cumbersome and such a nightmare that I finished the album and I was very happy with it. And I didn't pick up my guitar for another 2 years. Um, and then getting back into it, the technology surrounding home recording and home audio production had increased even more, and I had been listening to this one man musical project called Metroid Metal, run by a wonderful fellow named Grant Henry, and his stuff sounded amazing. And I remember thinking, he's doing this out of his home. Why can I not attain this? And Grant actually had a section up on his little, community page about how he does his stuff. And it provided a, detailed but not exhaustive outline of what he does. And I kind of used that as my template to get back into it and try to establish a better process for this. And Grant and I have actually been friends since. He plays in my live band when we perform. He lives out in Santa Cruz now, even though I'm on the East Coast. And so it's, there have been a lot of good friendships that came from this. And that was as much of a learning tool as anything else. Another thing I fell into is there's a monthly competition called Dwelling of Duels. And it's through this video game music community called The Shiz. It grew up around, it was the fan page for this band called the Mini Bosses, which were one of the progenitors of this thing. But the point is, every month there was a theme picked, whether it was, Street Fighter games or, action games or DOS games or whatever. And whoever wanted to would pick a song from within that, parameter, record a cover of it, do all their own stuff, and submit it anonymously. And everyone that collaborated in this each month, plus everyone else in the community, would listen to these anonymous submissions and rank them and provide feedback. And, the feedback provided there was just as useful or not useful as from any other source. You kind of have to weigh what applies to you and what doesn't, especially since art is so, it's artistic. There
yeah.
are there are very tangible things with how you want it to sound, but how you want it to sound is what dictates where you're going with it. So, there was bad feedback I got. I don't mean like feedback that was negative about the stuff I did. Of course, there was that. I was still learning. But, a certain amount of feedback that I would receive from there that I would think about and try to apply and then dismiss as not being relevant. But there was a lot of good stuff. there too. And since it was a monthly thing and it was fun, and we were just a bunch of dudes in our 20s that were, you had a free weekend, and if you didn't want to drink that weekend, you could crank out a song real easily. Back in the early mid 2000s, it was kind of a regular source of self improvement. And I also was lucky enough to fall in with a few other more established composers. Jesse Harlan, who's done the soundtrack for the Mafia games and Star Wars: The Old Republic, a bunch of stuff like that. I ended up doing some assistant work for him that grew into a larger relationship, and I got to shadow him and a uh, a mixing engineer named Ronan Murphy as they were up in Studio D in Sausalito, California, doing the mix for the Mafia 3 soundtrack, and a few other situations like that that kind of helped me, take what I had learned in what admittedly was really just kind of a amateur hobby space and apply it to something more professional and see how it held up there. And it's just been a refining process since that time. I spent a lot of time listening to other music in very specific and controlled ways to try and identify what I like about it, what it is I want to be able to replicate, what I don't like, and how to avoid it, all that stuff. And there have been various little training things from time to time. You find a guy that is known for good guitar stuff, and then you find an interview with him or a seminar he does about how he processes his guitars, and just stuff like that. But
Do you see a lot of folks that what you just mentioned right there, a guy that's good at guitars? Do you find that most folks in your line of work niche down into I do bass, that's my thing. I do percussion, I do vocals. I mean, do you usually find that you have to go to different specialists to create a finished product, or are most folks going to be good at everything, but maybe they're just really into this one particular instrument or sound?
in my experience, um, I think that anyone that's doing this with any sort of success as dictated by bringing in money by it, needs to have the foundation of working broadband, doing a whole
Mm.
song or a whole album or different genres, all that stuff. And as certain people spend more time in their particular career path and pursuing their interests with this, um, it will sometimes grow from that into a more niche or specialized kind of role. um, I think that what I was referring to more was that it's someone whose productions I like in general, and I see their, if I happen to think like, oh, this guy Scott Elliott is great at producing death metal, and in particular, I really like the relationship between how his rhythm guitars and the bass sounds. And then I will see that he's like, puts up something on his page. Hey, I'm doing a clinic on how I process my guitars. And I'll think, wow, well, I like his stuff, and I particularly like how he does this thing with guitars. So let me go look at that. Um, I think back in the day, you would read stories about, you know, a band like Def Leppard or someone that, they track here, and then for the bass or the drums or whatever, they want to go to this specific area to do that there. And of course, it's some other country or something because they're just swimming in production money.
I
But,
know.
that back in the day, I think had more to do with a specific space being well known for imparting a certain acoustic characteristic to something, and that is still very much valid these days. But the ability to record things direct or virtually, using an electronic drum kit, say, instead of tossing up a bunch of mics around a drum kit in a room that is designed to sound good, and all that stuff. So you know, I think the need to go different places for special things isn't quite as present as it was back then. Um, but it's just an entirely different landscape. I will say this: if I'm having trouble with a particular thing, I have a kind of a network of people that I will go to for certain things, and I will pick who I ask based on the nature of the question. Um, Sometimes I just get a guitar line where there's just some issue with it, and for some reason the tools at my disposal and the processes I've used in the past to effectively handle that just aren't cutting it. That just happens.
Hmm.
And so, in a situation like that, I know I can hit up, just for example, someone like Grant Henry again, and he does this stuff all the time, and I can send him the file and be like, look, this is having this weird noise thing, or there's some screeching sound on the pick attack that I just can't get rid of. What do you think? And he might have encountered something like that before. I might go to him or someone else because I know they've worked with maybe the same client I'm currently working with and might have some further insight, stuff like that. I think I provided a very extensive answer to your question that didn't really answer the question.
No,
So if you
no,
need to
it did.
redirect me, just say the word.
No, no, it absolutely did. And I want to kind of take that a step further. What I'm noticing is you have a network of people. Do you find that I guess, your occupation, your community of audio engineers, do you get a lot of collaboration and people that there's no ego here? I'm willing to help. Man, tell me what you need, and I'm glad to provide my advice. Or do you find there's a lot of gatekeeping, or this is my specialty and I don't want to share my knowledge?
um,
Or is it a mixed bag?
I'd say it's a mixed bag, but only by definition.
Mm,
One of the nice things about working, largely in this video game cover band sphere, and I hesitate to even say it like that because that's not where all my work comes from. It's where I
mhm,
got started and it's where I've developed most of my stronger relationships. But like, the people I'm talking about, even though we were talking about Sonic the Hedgehog covers back in 2012, one of the guys is the bassist for Trans-Siberian Orchestra now. And, Grant did a bunch of the music for Steven Universe. And, we've all kind of gone into other things. So it every time I say, oh, yeah, this video game cover scene, I don't want the listeners to be like, wait a minute, this guy has no experience in anything. Anyway, this sphere of audio, by and large, is, in my experience, has been more welcoming, has had less ego and narcissism, and just in general has had a better sense of sharing in the excitement surrounding what we do than other scenes I've been in. And some of it has to do with the fact that it's decentralized. A lot of this stuff is online, and like for example, the five people in my band, I live in Rochester. Grant's in the Bay Area, California. Our bassist and drummer are in North Carolina, and our third guitarist is in Pittsburgh. So we clearly don't meet up for band practices regularly, and a lot of us will only see each other if we happen to be at a convention or something. Um, but the nice thing about that is you can kind of cherry pick who you want to work with. Back in the day, if I was doing this 30 years earlier than I had, I would have been limited to the people that were available locally within driving distance and the studios and stuff that were available there. And there's nothing wrong with that, but once you expand that pool from your local area to the United States or to every country that speaks English that I can effectively interact with, you have a much larger pool of people to pick from. Um, and with the video game thing too, I think that I'm 41 right now, and I think that the people that were getting started with this when it was still young, a lot of them were coming from the background of growing up when video gaming and this sort of stuff wasn't as just a normal accepted thing. It was a nerd hobby, and it was something that to a certain extent you'd get made fun of, and it just it appeals to people that tend to be more you know uh, introspective and less socially outgoing and stuff like that. And I think as a function of that, having suddenly this community where it's a bunch of people that are kind of used to being by themselves because other people, give them a hard time about stuff. All of a sudden, you find tons of people that are not only not going to give you a hard time about that stuff, but are very, very interested in the same thing you are, and just as obsessively focused on the technical aspects of audio or this, that, and the other. It tends to feel more like a bunch of people that have finally found their tribe, and less like a group of people that know, there's only X amount of money to be wrung out of this thing each month, and they want to make sure they're at the top of it to get as much as they can. You do run into personalities that you don't jive with, and unfortunately, a few times people that, yeah, objectively, that's just a person you never want to deal with again. But the percentage of that happening is far less than any other musical community I've been a part of, and it's great.
The video game genre, when I was young, I would go to the mall on a Saturday. I'd ride my bike over with a roll of quarters, and I had an arcade, and there was one or two buttons and a joystick. And that was my, Galaga, Space
Yeah.
Invaders, 1943 video games of that time. And then, you fast forward to college, and I have friends that would be getting together for weekend LAN parties where they would all
Yeah, playing
bring.
Quake and stuff. And
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And I'm leaving to go out to do my best and usually failing to talk to a girl, and they're, playing video games. And it wasn't something that clicked with me. I never had looked down on it at all. It just wasn't something that I was into like they were.
And it was still very new. There
Yeah.
wasn't this established history of like, it's not like, yeah, your folks and your grandparents also had friends that were going out and playing baseball every weekend while they were studying to be a lawyer or something. It's this new take on things that felt very indulgent and very, there was a lot of news coverage about, the zombifying effects, like how, they talked about TV and stuff. So,
Well,
yeah.
you move forward to where I remember a few years ago, I was in the firehouse one evening, and we were after dinner, and some of the guys were playing, I forget what game it was, Halo or something like that. And they handed me a joystick or a controller, and I'm looking at it and like, man, there's more buttons on this. I don't even know what to do.
Uh-huh.
So I tried and failed miserably to play, but I sat back and I watched them play, and it dawned on me. And, this is a few years ago, to compare it even to the video games in, 2025, the graphics and the music and the story and everything involved in the game was on a multiple levels higher
Oh,
in
yeah.
in its depth and its quality and the entertainment that it offers you. And I remember thinking, golly, that is impressive. And I've even found myself listening to a couple of, I think it was Assassin's Creed had some music that I thought, wow, this is really just cool music to listen to while I'm editing a podcast or something along those lines.
Oh, yeah.
It's come so far. I can see why people are drawn to it because it's on such a professional level.
The overall objective quality of this stuff is just continued to skyrocket. And let me step back. Skyrocket might not be the right term because, as time has gone on, the leaps in graphical fidelity and stuff, it's diminishing returns just as a function of, the rate of improving technology and the fact that, let's say we have some new breakthrough in graphics and all of a sudden, you can have way more fidelity and lighting effects and stuff. And that's all great. But now your team needs to be able to generate content to utilize that processing power,
Yeah.
So like my wife and I just this past weekend got a PS5. Finally, it's been out for, 5 years at this point, but we finally got one and tossed in a newer video game, the remake of Dead Space. We're big horror fans. And, I was pretty blown away by it, but still, it felt like, yeah, this looks better than the PS4, but it wasn't like going from the Nintendo to Super Nintendo or, from that to a PlayStation or something.
Yeah.
So it is slowing down, but I'm being pedantic here. I agree with you. I think that the ability to tell a story and to have an emotional interaction with the audience is just insane. It's as good, if not better, than any other artistic medium because there's a level of interaction that I think generally, you don't have with people consuming media. You do with books and written stuff to a certain extent because the reader needs to be filtering that stuff through their own imagination to be, generating the story to a certain extent. With movies and TV, it's easy to just sit there and kind of accept what's happening. But with video games, you're making decisions on a micro and a macro basis. And, there are stories of daring deeds and all this stuff. And it's just great, And I think that especially since the nature of a lot of our work has kind of, I don't know, coalesced around you sit at a desk or you stand up and do some form of labor. I think that having this increased ability to go explore different ways of life and different worlds and, different perils and joys and all that stuff, it's more important now than any time before.
Yeah. Do you think that VR is the next frontier when it comes to video games?
I don't know. I've seen a few pushes for VR to be the next thing. Like I remember there being stuff in arcades back in, I don't know, the mid 2000s that were purporting to have VR stuff, and I don't even know if that's technically what it was at that point. But then, maybe about 8 or 10 years ago, I was seeing it all over again, and it just seems like it keeps coming up and then not quite catching on and then fading and then doing it again, but each time it sticks around a little bit more. I don't know if it's ever going to become like the primary form of people gaming or consuming, visual media or anything. But I do think that, these days, if I see a game announced that's only for VR, or if I see someone talking about, playing something on VR at their home, it doesn't raise my eyebrow like it used to. It doesn't come off as this novelty. It's more just part of the zeitgeist of how people, use media and entertainment. I don't know if it'll ever take over.
Yeah, I guess time will tell on that one. But let's
Yeah.
go back to when you first got into the recording studio as an audio engineer, or you were learning, or you had some folks that kind of took you under their wing and were showing you some things. I've been in a few recording studios in my time on this earth, and I have to admit, you walk into some of those things, there's a million sliders and a million knobs, and it's
Hmm.
almost like, man, I'm glad somebody knows what they're doing, because I have no idea what any of this stuff does. I don't even know how to turn the volume up. So is it a bit overwhelming to go in there, but is it also kind of exciting because I just have endless days of learning and tinkering and finessing with the sound.
Right. Well, it's first off, just to clarify, I don't work in some big tricked out recording studio. The recording stuff, specifically recording that I do, has to do with voice stuff like we're talking right now. I'm recording through the same setup I use for my audiobook narration and stuff, and then recording guitar and bass. And the guitar and bass, I don't need to run through an amp. That just goes into my audio interface, which is a glorified analog digital converter with a few knobs, and get that into my computer. And I do all of my amp stuff digitally in my PC. So if you look at my workstation here, there are definitely esoteric looking pieces of equipment that if you weren't familiar with, would be like, oh God, I can't touch that. But it's not like walking into the traditional studio that listeners here are probably thinking of, where it's a big board with a few sets of speakers and then racks of a bunch of outboard gear, and the main desk faces this window into the adjoining room where there's a guy at a mic, or some guy at a drum kit, or some gal playing guitar or something like that. All of my stuff has to do with um, everything after that point. So if you went to a studio and recorded everything there, but for some reason you didn't want that same studio or those people to handle everything afterwards, which is balancing the relative volume of the different recordings, handling panning, EQing things, compressing, just all of the million little things that are done to take it from a group of raw recordings to a finished song or whatever that sounds like how you would expect it to sound when placed up against similar things by other artists. That's all the stuff I do. So I have the luxury of working in a less cluttered space, which is nice because it's also a smaller space. But when I do walk into a recording studio, which doesn't happen that frequently these days, there is a little bit of that, oh man, just look at all this feeling, but I'd say it's maybe 20 or 30%. Oh, geez, I better not sit on something accidentally or
Yeah.
bump up. And, the other 70% is, this is so cool, And even if I don't have the same pieces of outboard gear that are there, or if, the mixing board the guy is using has, 30 tracks more than I'm used to and all these other options, I know that for the most part, if I just walked over and looked at what the labels are, I would pretty quickly have an idea of how it functions at least on a rudimentary level, you know. Um, and with a lot of that stuff, it really comes down to the same things. And you know, with those big mixing boards, you see like a million sliders and 5 million knobs. Something to keep in mind is what that really is it's one or two sliders and maybe four knobs times however many tracks they want to be able to do that with.
I
So,
see.
for each track, you have a mic coming into there. So, like on a drum kit, just to provide a simplified explanation, if you have eight tracks in front of you, there's a slider that controls the volume and probably a knob for panning left to right. There might be some controls about, handling equalization or compression there, how bassy you want it or how trebly. And that's it. But all that just controls the mic coming from the kick drum. And then you'll have that same set of controls connected to another mic coming from the top of the snare, that sort of thing. So it's not like, oh my God, there's these gajillion things I need to keep track of. It's that there's only a few things you need to keep track of times however many things you're working with. I know I'm using the most vague descriptions possible, but does that make sense?
No, it absolutely puts it in perspective. It kind of dials it down to where it's not so overwhelming. You realize is each one of these is just on repeat for that and for that and for that. And so it's just a redundancy, but it can look overwhelming when you don't know what you're looking at.
Exactly. And it's that sense of it feeling overwhelming is compacted by the fact that you look at that stuff and one of the first thoughts you have is that's expensive, I
Hmm.
can't damage that,
Yeah.
or especially back in the day when people were recording to tape and stuff like that, God forbid you accidentally do something that records over part of the recording or,
Mm.
forget to arm a track before you tell the guy, all right, start drumming, Um, and that's one of the nice things about what I do is that I'm generally not in a situation where I can cause a fatal error to a client's project without, there being more than enough time and copious backups to, undo it to the point where it might as well never have happened.
When I see
Um,
those big boards like that, the first thing that runs through my head is I'm going to need a label maker because
oh yeah.
I want to label everything.
Yeah. You'll see labels a lot. You'll see, other funny things, like I've seen people, set something to a place they want it and then just put a drop of super glue on the dial to hold it there because they know that, on this board in particular, if I turn this fader up past 8, it's exponentially it gets higher past that point, or, there's some crackling issue there, or, you know, labels and kind of fly by the seat of your pants modification is fairly normal in those situations.
Yeah.
And the title audio engineer used to, and still does in more traditional recording situations. It refers not just to engineering the audio, but being able to engineer and work on the physical components there. If your board or one of your pieces of outboard gear, blew something or something shorted out. Generally, the guys that were working on that stuff recording knew how to get under there and fix most of the stuff that was going to go wrong, because if you have to wait to call a technician or something, there goes at least that day's worth of revenue, if not the next few also.
Yeah. The When I hear you talk about the audio engineer and the adjusting and the fine tuning, that's very much the human aspect, the human interaction of fine tuning or getting the sound that everyone is looking for.
Hmm.
AI is something that is just kind of creeping into every industry. And I know
Hmm.
that without a doubt, it's into the recording industry. I have the opinion, I don't know if you share it, that AI may make some things faster and smoother, and it can help in certain areas, but the final product, there's always going to be that human, intangible thing that AI will not be able to reproduce. And it's going for that specific sound. It's kind of like records, they're perfectly imperfect.
Hmm.
They have the pops and the cracks and whatnot that give it the warmth and the character. Do you have any opinions on AI, or what are your overwhelming thoughts on that? Overlying thoughts.
Tim, I recall before we actually got live here asking you if you had a preference as to whether I swore or not, and you said you would prefer if I didn't. And now you bring this up.
Oh, okay. My
No,
apologies.
no, no, no. I'm more than happy to talk about it. I'm just being a little hyperbolic here.
Yeah, I get it.
Um, it's it's impossible to say what the overall impact of AI is going to be on this industry or any. It is still fairly new in this latest public awareness, and things are changing so rapidly, and just in general, it's also happening in the context of, and I don't want to talk about politics, but like, for example, the current administration is, my understanding is working towards preventing regulation of AI stuff on a state level. And whether or not I'm, correct or, oversimplifying that or something, the point is that not only do we have this very new technology that's growing at a fairly rapid pace, but it of course is going to be subjected to whatever mindsets have control over that stuff at the time that it is becoming apparent. So I have no way of knowing how big or small this is going to get. But I do agree with you. I think that the the computational capabilities of AI to handle data is something that we are all going to probably benefit from. And what I'm talking about are, things like, parsing through insane amounts of, medical testing and coming up with, new ideas based on correlating that massive amount of data, or things like going through and, if I have a full recording of a narration and, you know, every once in a while the narrator's cat was walking into the room and meowing, I can go through there and strip that stuff out manually. But if I could have an AI that just knew, the range of what a cat's meow sounds like and can go through and remove that without causing, destructive artifacting to the audio, that's great. Those are all non-creative, non-artistic uses of it. And
Productivity enhancements.
exactly. And I think that that is where it can and should succeed. And in terms of using it for anything creative, I'm staunchly against it. And I mean that, everything from something as egregious as using it to write an entire story or write a song, you know, at that end of the spectrum, like someone just going in and typing in, make me a country song about pickup trucks or something,
Yeah.
something that requires the least amount of artistic consideration on the part of the person instigating this whole process. But even so far as, taking it to the other end of like, look, I'm just taking it back to a prose writing situation. I've written 12 chapters of this book. I need to, I'm just kind of stuck with what these characters are doing. Here's the context of the whole book. Give me, 25 options for what I might write next. And in a situation like that, it can be argued that that's not very different from what people do normally. It looks at everything that's come before. It makes a bunch of different um, possible suggestions, which is what, if you were writing a story, you would be thinking of in your mind anyway. And then you would select the one that seems like it jives most with what you want to do.
You're brainstorming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you're brainstorming.
Right.
And your brainstorming is based on so many things that you could, label and identify if someone asked you, as well as millions of things that you couldn't. And that stems from, everything from how you're feeling that day to, if you have let's say a bias towards, certain colors, meaning certain things are having associations for you, or word choice. Obviously, if you're writing a story, you can open a thesaurus and find a million different ways of saying the same thing. But there's context with certain things. You might choose to use a word or, place it before or after an adverb in a way that, hints towards something else earlier, or can contain a double meaning that'll cause the reader to think. Or might be a little indicator that, some character saying something, oh, they phrased it this way. Wait a minute, that makes me think of this other person, all that sort of stuff. There's
Nuance.
there's nuance and there's subtext and there's the ability to be playful with art. And I mean
Yeah.
that in a very broad sense. Like, I
Hmm.
mean, playful as in you could say something that might amuse someone, or, if you're writing something, you could drop the hint that, the protagonist is talking to the murderer right there and they don't know it, but that sort of stuff is all going to be lost through AI. And yes, these things are still getting trained and getting better, and it might get to a point where it's able to replicate that, but only insofar as it's able to steal it from what it has been trained on, And even if it's been trained on, objectively the best authors of all time or something, that doesn't mean that it's the right choice for your story. And it also pushes things towards a certain realm of homogeny, as more people do this stuff.
Right.
All it's doing is picking from what's come before and rehashing it. And it might do that in ways that, could be found interesting, but it's not intentionally doing it in a way that's interesting.
You know, I've been using AI a tiny bit with some of my podcasts, and there's some neat software. It's a productivity thing, like I went back to a little bit ago. When I listen to someone's interview, some folks they they sometimes struggle to convey what they're wanting to say, and so you have long pauses when they're speaking, or they have a lot of filler words that is part of their regular speech. And in order to make the conversation flow and be smoother and easier for the listener, AI has software that can go in and remove the filler words and close up the gaps, and it polishes up the podcast without removing the soul. And I think that's the thing about AI that I don't think will ever, it's going to get close, and it's going to be difficult if it's not already to tell the difference between music or art that's created by a human being versus artificial intelligence. But I hope that I'm not proven wrong, but I believe that the human being, the soul and the emotions and the spirit is what is conveyed. There's a warmth and a relational, you can't put your finger on it, but this feels genuine versus there's something missing over here and I just can't put my finger on it, but they look and sound identical.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's hard to fully define and quantify all of the
Yeah.
the little things that makes art relatable. And I think to a certain extent that also comes down to what makes things resonate with certain people, as opposed to other people. Like, you can take an objectively great piece of art, like the novel Grapes of Wrath,
Hmm.
say. I think that by and large, most people agree, yes, that is a great American novel.
Hmm.
Obviously, there are people that don't really care for that book or hate that book, and that's fine. And it doesn't mean that they're just, idiots or, Luddites or someone, that Philistines, they don't appreciate art. Um, it's just that certain things resonate differently with different people. And I think that it's going to be interesting to look at that in the context of AI, because if I create a piece of art like a song and it resonates with someone else, generally there's a certain understanding that the reason it resonates with them has, something to do with the emotional um, energy I put into it and what I was trying to convey as the artist. Any artistic experience is a certain amount the creator and a certain amount, the person observing it or partaking of it. With AI, you only have that second half. If a person responds to it in a way that's emotional for them, I don't feel that it negates that emotional response the person is having. It's not coming from a human place. You're not having a connection with another person or with a human experience. To me, it feels like if someone's able to pull one over on you, like, I don't, it's just that thing, you see, and it's kind of just, how do I phrase this properly? There's a certain type of tropey social interaction you see where, like, someone will be bullying someone else or something and do the whole like, oh, we should hang out. You want to come over and hang out with the guys, And it's like, oh yeah, sure. And it's like, oh, well, you know what? No, we're not going to hang out with you. Why would you ever think we would do that? And it's like,
Right.
well, because you told me to,
Let's
because
do
you told me
lunch.
that was your intention.
Yeah.
And so with something like this, it kind of feels the same to me. It's like if someone presented a piece of AI generated whatever to me and was, telling me this is just a piece of art. I want to know what you think of it without even mentioning whether or not it's AI. If I looked at that and I had a response to it, and then I was told, well, that's created by AI, my feeling would be like, well, okay, then so what? You duped me. How is that any different than me? If I'm out on a walk somewhere and I happen to catch, the way lighting hits a stone or something as water's going over it, or something very, very not human created, I can have a reaction to that, and still that is a more genuine and earnest human experience because it's relating to the world around me. It's not looking at a thin skin that's been placed over, a pile of kind of dead art that's been crunched into the shape it thinks it wants to be for you. um I don't know. This is something that it's been tricky because more and more you see people that are trying to put forward AI generated music, images, whatever. And it's very telling to me that the vast majority I've seen are very defensive and very prone to denying that there was any AI generation involved in it. If this was the type of thing that people felt wasn't, I'll just use the word cheating just because it's an easy shorthand. If people felt like it wasn't cheating, then there wouldn't be any need to disguise how they're doing it. Does that make sense?
That's an excellent point. And to take that even a step further, I would wonder if they're a little bit ashamed of their laziness, because if you compare a band or a musician that plays the notes, that's practiced, that's gotten the mistakes, and then they've gotten the improvement and they've perfected it, and then they record it, and then you come in and press a few buttons and you create AI music, quote unquote, and then you put it out there. That's not the same. I earned that recording. You just pushed a couple of buttons and had a computer make some noise that sounds similar, and they're not the same.
I agree. And I think that's a tricky argument to make because while I entirely agree, I think that bringing concepts like, you know, what someone deserves and what they've earned into it, those are very nebulous concepts that are easy to have arguments against, that are valid arguments. Like, for example, there's a guitarist named Jason Becker. And Jason Becker was a, shred virtuoso back in the 80s. He was in this, among other things, this musical project called Cacophony with Marty Friedman, who went on to be a lead guitarist for Megadeth. And anyway, so Jason Becker was, extremely good at what he did and put in a ton of time, and then ended up with a crippling medical condition where he's entirely in a chair. He is only able to move and communicate through eye movement, and I think he has some apparatus that he can use his mouth to control. But he's still making music, and he's using various tools for that. And I'm not sure if he has started incorporating AI or not into it, but he was using things like MIDI sequencers and drum machines and all that stuff. And those are things that in the past have been targets of similar um, arguments that I'm using against AI right now. It's soulless. It has no humanity, this or that. But in that specific situation with Jason Becker, this is someone that absolutely has not only earned it, but has been dealt like a really unlucky hand that he couldn't have done anything to prevent. This isn't a situation where, he OD'd on something and had some, neurological issue as a result and then could no longer play. Not that that justifies what happens to the person in that situation, but I can at least see an argument that's like, well, he played with fire and he got burnt or something. This is a very pure situation of this guy just kind of got screwed over by the universe. And even in that situation, though, he is making decisions on what he's making based on the sense of music that he has developed over the course of him learning to play an actual instrument, Um, and the argument could be, well, if he can use something like that, how is that any different than someone using AI or something? And it's just that if you're coming from a standpoint of not having put in the time, it's not that there is this karmic balance of, what you have earned and what you deserve and what you don't deserve and stuff like that. It's more that you are only able to interact with that interface and make selections, on the resulting stuff that comes back. You can only do that as effectively as you know what you're working with. And if you haven't spent the time working with this stuff, then you're going to be making very naive and amateurish, and I might add, obviously amateurish decisions about this stuff. And I've seen it. I've had. I won't name names, but there's someone that I have done work with in the past that sent me, "Oh, hey, I'm working on this musical project. Wanted to know what you think," and sent me the files. And my first thought is, this just sounds like garbage. Like, yeah, it's polished. It sounds like a pop song insofar as it's, the bass isn't, you know, blowing out my speakers, or it's not saying incomprehensible lyrics that obviously are gibberish or Esperanto or something. It's just, yeah, this is exactly what it would seem like if you got a toddler or someone that has no knowledge of actively being involved with music, of just passively receiving it, and then told them that they had the ability to do what they want. And there's nothing wrong with that when it is a part of a learning process, because that's what we all do with instruments. The first time I picked up a guitar, I very obviously was an amateur. And the first songs I wrote were very obviously amateurish. But you develop that with time, and whether or not, the personal growth and reward and fulfillment that comes with that has any bearing or tangible value, strictly from the standpoint of, if you are trying to create a piece of art, whether it's legitimately or through AI, what do you want to do with that? And if what you want to do with that involves anything beyond, I just want to have it, then you're not going to be as capable at accomplishing your goal as you would if you actually had the background working with this stuff. I stumbled across a quote online a while back that I actually saved a screenshot of, and I'm just want to read it real quick. It says, "People making things with AI don't love making things; they love having things, and capitalism has convinced them that ownership is self-actualization." So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and I can't say that I absolutely agree with it, but I do agree that it feels much more like a situation where you go and buy a CD. I'm dating myself here by saying buy a CD. But, if you go buy a CD and you take it home and you listen to it and you pick the tracks you like and the tracks you don't like, that's fine. That's part of that is the experience of being a music consumer. Now, that is not the same as being someone that makes music. And I think that I mean, hell, when I'm writing a song, I will sometimes flub a note, play something wrong or make a mistake and, shift a track over so it starts on the offbeat instead of the downbeat. And those are all accidental things. I can't really say that, like, those are the result of my creative decisions, but sometimes I'll hear it in that new context or hear that off note and be like, oh my God, that's way better than I was going to do. And none of that stuff exists in AI generation of things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm harping on this a lot, but I think that it's fine for data things, procedural things, non-human things, but frankly, anyone that's using it in any sort of creative context, it makes me lose pretty much all respect for what that person's doing, you know? So,
Well, yeah. I mean, it's gonna be interesting to see where AI goes. There's so many different avenues that
yeah.
it can help and it can harm and it can remove the soul from something. And I think time's going to be what's going to tell us the eventual answer of all that, and hopefully it doesn't take over the world. So
Well, that's one other thing, and this is probably for a different podcast, but I think that all of the discussions around AI right now are largely running with the assumption that it will always be publicly available and free, and that everyone will have access to the same caliber of tools. And as soon as it gets to a point where, the processing power you can access or the quality of the stuff you can do is based on how much money you can pay, or that only certain people or certain entities have legal authority to access things, the whole landscape is going to be very different. And, who knows where that's going to go. But I think that it's very short-sighted for the people really championing AI for creative endeavors, to assume that it will always be the way it is with their unfettered access and that sort of thing.
yeah.
So,
What do you like most about your job? If you could name one or two big things.
besides that, I just get to listen to heavy metal and read horror stories all day.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, what I like is, well, in a meta sense, I like the people I work with. Um, the fact that I've gotten into this world has absolutely been the largest single thing that has shaped my life. My wife is someone I met through this video game music community, Um, and besides the people, from a mixing and mastering standpoint, I love getting a group of files that are raw where I can hear what the artist has been doing. I can hear how they care about what they're doing, and I can hear what they're going for. And to slowly, through a million little micro decisions of, do I want to nudge this up another decibel, or maybe I don't want to have the high pass on the EQ here when the guitar is just by itself because I really want that low end. All those little things that take it from being you know how it is in a raw sense, and augmenting all of those intentions that the artist has to take it from being, a raw piece of metal that you can cut someone with if you have enough force behind it, to being exactly that razor sharp, lethal thing that you want to immediately just drop the people that are listening to it. And, that isn't always possible. And sometimes the vision I have for something differs from what the artist wants, to the point that, we can get it to where the artist wants, but personally I feel like it should have gone differently. But still, I love that refining process. It, not to, overly aggrandize myself, but it feels like sculpting. I think of when old artists that were way more talented than I am, were chipping away pieces of marble because they saw that form in there. And that's what I like about it. And the cool thing is that I get to do that in a situation where I'm listening to a bunch of guys dressed up like werewolves screaming about mummies chasing co-eds or something. So it manages to be this really technical and creative process that has a lot of just visceral wow factor for me. I still just love hearing a good, distorted guitar just palm mute a low open chord. It just makes me like, forget that I'm 41 and doing this professionally in my room, and makes me think back to, being 14 and seeing Slayer for the first time or something. And, the only thought in my mind was just, oh, yes. I love that I still get that on a day-to-day basis for the most part. That's
Your
wonderful.
creative juices are just constantly flowing, aren't they?
Most of the time, yeah. And I mean,
Yeah.
you'll have off days, and, I'd be
Sure.
lying if I said there weren't projects where, I take it because I need the gig, or it
Mhm.
fills a empty slot or something, and not that I'm super jazzed up about it. But, I've been lucky enough to not to have to work on anything where I'm just like, counting the minutes until I can finish the project. It's by and large always fun, and it's you're working with people that feel the same way about it too. And that's something else. Going back to the AI thing, real quick, I have a disclaimer that I don't work with musical artists where that was part of the process, and outside of my ethical stance on it, when I'm talking to someone about mixing their song, if I do well with it, I want them to come back to me and be like, dude, that sounds so damn cool, and like, oh, we were listening to it and just couldn't stop this, that, and the other. And I like them talking to me on the front end about, this is why I wrote this song and this is what it means to me and this, that, and the other. And that doesn't exist with AI stuff. Even if someone is going and like, well, I have this very deep emotional feeling for this piece of art I want to create, but I don't have the talent or the means to create it. So I had AI do it. And now I want to, polish it up. Even if it is representative of what they were trying to achieve, there still isn't that almost maternal connection to it from their standpoint. It's no different than like if let's say I was making a film, I was a director, okay, and I go to you, Tim, and I say, hey, I want you to score this and make the music. You could create a score that is exactly what I was hoping it would be. It just hits all the right notes, no pun intended, but still, that is a collaborative process between you and another creative professional, and there is dialogue there. And anyone listening to this that has the thought, well, there's dialogue with an AI too, just shut up. It's not the same thing at all.
No, it isn't. It can look like it is on the surface, but when you start getting into the muddy waters is where the human and the AI separate. And it's I can see why you would like, you talked about having somebody come back to you and saying, man, I really like what you did here. You put your stamp on it, your unique human impression and your unique take on it. And then another human being picked up on that. It registered with them and they came back for more. And it's kind of like, Michelangelo had those things where there was a muscle in the forearm that the would
I know
only
exactly what you're talking about.
yeah,
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
only be shown if his pinky was raised. And guess what he sculpted? His pinky was raised, and it's those kind of unique human takes that I think AI is going to struggle to uh, creative whims, I think is where they're really going to fall short.
Yeah. And it's because it can only be derivative.
Right.
And, that might change. And I'm not saying that I have a crystal ball or anything like that, but I I don't think I will ever get past the concept that there needs to be a direct human connection to the creation of art
Right.
for it to have any sort of validity. And, that's just me. But anyway, going back to what we were talking about, I love that I get to work with people that are excited about this stuff as much, if not more, than I'm excited about it too. Like I mentioned the whole, singing about mummies chasing co-eds thing. I was working with an artist a few years back. I still work with called Pitch Black Manor, and they do a bunch of Halloween and gothy themed rock songs and stuff. And when I was first emailing with the dude, Chad Pfeiffer, who was my point of contact for the project, somewhere in there he said, "We want the album to feel like you're just sitting down to watch Return of the Living Dead." And for me, I'm like, okay, I can't believe I'm getting paid to do this. Like, that's like the magic phrase anyone could have said to me. It's like, hey, you want to come with me? We're going to swim through shark infested waters, but we want it to feel like Return of the Living Dead. I'd be like, dude, I'm jumping in with you. So the fact that I get to work with people that have that same level of kind of quirky, but earnest sort
Vision.
of ridiculous sense about things,
Hmm. Yeah.
I like the thing, you're working with people that are pouring all this time and all this energy into doing something that they truly love and at the same time can recognize this is absurd, death metal in general is like that. I love death metal. I think it's some of the heaviest stuff out there and I enjoy listening to it, but there is a sense of self-parody to it that it's my favorite when people are aware of that. Not the gruff metal, oh, we're so serious. What are you doing laughing at this stuff? But it's like, yeah, this is inherently absurd. And it can be absurd at the same time that it can also be the heaviest thing you're going to hear that month, And I love that element to this specific world I'm in.
Aside from AI, because I
Yeah.
know that that's a bit of a flashpoint I've picked up on.
Yeah.
What are some things that, every job has things you like and things you don't like. What are some things that you dislike, the mundane or the insufferable aspects of your career?
Um, I'm a freelancer, so I'm
Mhm.
not doing this through any sort of corporation. Um, I mean, I have my own business, but not an external corporation. The irregularity of things can be frustrating, and I'm also someone that really likes to have stuff planned out in advance and know when things are going to happen. Um, but it's just not how it goes with this. You don't know when work's going to come in, and there are times when you're, you know, not getting much for a couple months, and times where there's everything at once, and that is a little frustrating. Um, the nature of working with creative people means that you'll have a larger percentage of situations where folks can flake on you or be unprepared or stuff like that.
Yeah.
There are a few situations I've gotten into where we'll start on a project and then something will happen on their end where they aren't able to finish it on the schedule they wanted, and then it'll sit half finished on my end for a few months or a year or several years. And, I honor the contracts I have with those people, but at the same point, now it's reopening stuff that's several years old. Maybe, I'm hearing things that I would have done differently back then. So I have the question of, man, do I want to redo the stuff I've already done? I'm also locked in at whatever payment rate that we agreed on back then. And, that very likely would have changed since that time, just stuff like that. I really like when things are clean and organized, and the nature of this work is that is impossible a lot of the time. Um, but really, the way I found to mitigate that is just discussing these things up front and managing expectations and communicating clearly. Um, and that's all I can do. There have been times I have fired clients, and there have been times I've finished projects and been very smiley, and in my mind thought I will never ever work with that person again. But those are few and far between, and they exist in every
Right. Well,
every
sure.
industry. So
There is the business side. I mean, you are, I guess, a small business owner. You own your company, but you also have the creative aspect of it. But there's also the nuts and bolts of I've got bills to pay. I've got, the structured things that are the unpleasant side of being a creative person. Do you find a struggle there I really want to be creative today, but I have to sit down and be Mr. Administrative and get everything done, that I have to get done today?
very much so, and
Mm,
in a couple different ways actually. First off, there is you know, that sense of, well, there's the admin side of things and then the actual trade side of what I do. And generally I've set up a good process where I know, the times a day that I tend to be better at doing certain things and not others. And so I'm usually able to structure my day where I handle emails and invoices and stuff like that, during times when I'm not feeling like mixing or narrating and, shifting stuff around. But taking it back even a step further, that has been one of the negative side effects of doing this full time is that I am pursuing my own personal creative projects far less. And,
mm,
it's not that I don't like doing this stuff or anything. It's just that, there's a certain amount of hours I can spend during each day sitting at the computer in my studio, which just by the nature of how it has to function is rather dark and doesn't have any natural light coming in and is very quiet. And there's nothing wrong with that. But after 8 hours of doing that, I'm far less likely to be like, you know what, I think I want to go do that for 3 more hours, but this time
right.
working on something of my own.
Mhm.
If I was out, driving a delivery van or something, or even working a different office job somewhere, it would feel less like going back into that same mode again,
Mhm.
you know?
You're
So,
completely shifting gears.
yeah. And I miss working on my personal projects, and I still want to. And I find time to pick at it and stuff. And I have things that I plan on releasing and am working on, but just the rate at which I can get through this stuff is very different than it used to be. But all things said and done, I think probably anyone experiences that where they turn what originally was just a passion of theirs into a source of income or a career. Um, and I will say that it's much nicer in a situation like this where it tends to be fairly low impact physically. Like this would be different if I was running a daycare all day and then came home and like had to like play with my kids and give them a bath and like carry them around and all that stuff. This is just about uh, a certain amount of daily mental exhaustion and not about, oh God, I have nothing left and I have to go actually physically perform again.
Yeah. That's one question that when I talk with folks that are in their line of work that is a passion of theirs or something that they love, like I've got an interview scheduled with a competitive shooter here in another few weeks and a professional fisherman. And, folks that those are activities that a lot of folks do. I want to go and go fishing. I got the day off unexpectedly. I'm going to go with my dad or my brother or my buddy, and we're going to go fishing today. It's going to be great. When you do that every day and that's your job, does it take the fun out of it? And I'm wondering if that affects the longevity of the career, or do you eventually just find a balance?
I mean, I think it entirely depends on the person and the
Yeah.
specifics of the situation, but
Mhm.
just to, provide one anecdote, I I still have a band and we put out songs and stuff. And earlier this year, I was finalizing, we were putting out a cover of a Metallica song just for kicks. And while I was working on the mix for that, that's the closest analog to what I actually, do professionally. Like, of course, I recorded guitars for that and we filmed a video and I got to, jump around and headbang and all that stuff. And of course, that stuff's fun because I'm still 14 at heart. But, sitting down to mix it and go through and, handle any editing, pull out drumstick clicks and like a little pick scrape stuff you don't want, all that stuff. That's the point where it would be very easy for me to lose a lot of steam. Um, but I really still enjoy that part. And I enjoyed it working on a song that I'd listened to, a million times growing up, and then a number of times to, work out who was playing which guitar parts. And then I listened to it a bunch of times again as I was tracking the scratch tracks to send, files to everyone. And again, as I was recording my own parts. And then now as I'm editing it all together and doing the mixing, I'd set myself up to have the best chance at being burned out on this specific thing as possible. And still going through it, you know, I would be in work mode and focus on, okay, I need to do this. All right, there's that thing there. Let's pull out that spike noise and this and that. All right, let's listen back through it. And still, when I would go back and listen through a section, my mind would immediately have a certain amount of that thought of, I'm not just analyzing it anymore, but that visceral reaction of like, man, this just rules. This just kicks ass and this is
Mhm.
what I'm looking for. And I think that's great that I can still get that. And
Yeah.
part of it is that I'm working with people that I know enjoy this stuff too. And, there's, it's not like Fleetwood Mac where we're all just waiting for a chance to kill each other or something.
The you're kind of laying the groundwork for a question that I always ask, and that is, what types of soft skills or personality traits lend themselves to being successful in your line of work?
Oh man. Music in particular is interesting. Because like I said, you're, generally working with people that are creatively minded, and obviously it doesn't happen in all cases, but by and large, I've found that the people that tend to be very creative tend to um, not be as good with some other time management things and,
Mm,
punctuality and stuff like that,
mhm.
communication. And so part of it for me has been about finding ways to communicate better, especially since most of how I interact with people is remotely. So it's a lot of emails. You don't have body language and, facial expressions and stuff to help convey what you want. And I think that's developed into a very, uh, I don't want to say the word rigid, but almost like a cascading flow chart of how I go about communicating with people and structuring emails and stuff. Um, it's about writing things and communicating in a way that doesn't, not that it controls them or anything, but it helps hem them in their responses so they do hit the points that you need to have addressed. And it's stuff like that. It's stuff like just being like genuinely enthusiastic about the stuff you're working with, I would say is, one of the most important soft skills, even though it's not even a skill, like if I'm working with a client on a new metal album or something, and if we're trying to, nail down the sound we want to take it, and I mention some band or something, like I pull out, oh, so are you talking more like such and such or more like, Megadeth's So Far So Good, so what album? And sometimes you can just like hear it in their voice if you're on the phone or in the response on the email. You just happen to click on entirely the right thing with that person.
You're
And
speaking the same language.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just that, you're a tourist in that area, but like, if you and I wanted to talk right now about Dave Mustaine as a guitarist and how his interpersonal stuff has impacted the sound of the Megadeth albums from 1985 up through the present, we could talk about that for 3 hours,
No, we
And
couldn't, because I know who David Mustaine is, and that's about as far as it goes, man.
yeah, but I mean, the point I'm
Yeah,
making
yeah, I
is
get
that
it.
like, that stuff goes a long way towards making it a personal connection with someone, which is hard to do remotely anyway. And with creative stuff like this, when an artist that, you know, I'm assuming has poured their heart and soul into making their music and doing the performance as well as they can and getting it down, and now they're in the home stretch and they need to find someone to bring it to that is going to make it sound good. And I don't mean make it sound just how they want, but manage to realize the most likely somewhat amorphous and ambiguous vision they have for it in their mind, but also to bring in things that they didn't even know were an ingredient that needed to be included in that. And sometimes that's little things like, more tangible things. I can say, hey, do we want to put a reverse cymbal swell here just to kind of give some energy going into that? Or, how would you guys feel if we tracked another guitar line and, added a harmony here? There's stuff like that. But there's also just little things like, like I was talking about earlier, if you have a full band going and, you're listening to everything in one part of a song and then it drops out and there's just the guitar introducing a new part before the rest of the band slams back in. There are ways to handle that will be reflective of how you feel that music should go. And that's influenced by all the songs you've heard do similar things and the times you've liked that and not liked it. And also your personal thoughts about what you think would be cool to experiment with to try and give it a new sound. It's that interaction with the other person about a thing that you're commonly excited about. And I think that, not to pat myself on the back, but by and large, I have happy clients. And my assumption is that that is because I am able to accomplish what they want me to accomplish. But I had someone recently, they had been debating whether they were going to hire someone to master their stuff or if they were just going to do it themselves like they had with other stuff. And we had a number of very long communications on Discord about what they wanted and what the obstacles were that they had been facing that had led to them wondering to hire it out in the first place, what the song meant to them, all that stuff. And the culmination is that when we were done, that person said to me, I'm able to enjoy this again for the first time in months. And that is the coolest thing in the world for me to hear, because that that is what matters. It's not just about me being able to polish up what they've done in a way that, at its most base, a noble goal will sell, even though that's important, or on, a better level will connect with its audience. But if I can do something that helps the artist connect with their own creation again, that's, that is a unique human experience that not many people get to have. And as someone that's made a bunch of music and experienced that frustration of like, I'm so sick of this, I never want to hear it again, or I'm trying so hard to do what I'm hearing in my head and I can't do it, to be able to have someone in that situation and to step in and fix that for them. It's just so awesome. It's like it's validating for myself. It makes me feel like I'm doing something that actually matters to another person. On a tangible level, it means there's also a better chance that this will connect with the people that they want to have listen to it. And, it will sell more copies as a result of that, theoretically. There's a synergy to it that's multifaceted and multi-directional when things lock in perfectly. It functions on a tangible level, on a personal level, on an emotional level, on, I hesitate to say the word spiritual, but for some people, like that is the connection they have with their art. And, I'm sure I'm self-aggrandizing at this point, and I'm not trying to do that, but,
No,
you know,
I think you make a valid point. If someone has a creative task that they're absorbed in and they reach a wall and they can't get past it, it goes from a joy to a burden. And if you're able to step in and remove that wall and then allow them to fully realize what they're trying to do with that creative endeavor, you return the joy to them. So I can absolutely see why everybody would be ecstatic because I don't care what anybody says. If you can help somebody, like genuinely help somebody, not just I'm going to help you because of what I can get out of you, but if you can
yeah,
genuinely help somebody realize something, that has to make you and them both feel great.
it's wonderful. And I think it's one of the, if I want to get all whooshy about this, it's also one of the few pure joys that we as a species can have. It's that sense of I was able to communicate fully what I wanted to. And with music, any art, it's so subjective and it's so ambiguous and amorphous, like I said before. Like if you're thinking of a song you want to write, you're probably not thinking of every note and every drum beat. What you're thinking of is maybe a few little snippets of like specific things, and more than that, a general sense. Or for some people, it's just a color or a vibe, to pick the parlance of today. Um, but to help someone define that and either maintain or regain their love of that, that's a wholly human experience. I mean, insofar as we can't talk to the animals, and the art my cat does is usually just destructive in nature. Um, as far as I know, we're the only real species creating art, and the phenomenon of feeling alienated from your own artistic creation is terrible. And I I think that if I can be a part of removing that for someone, that's just so damn cool.
Yeah.
That makes me so happy. And the fact
That
that it's also, covering my cost of living is even
Oh,
better.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you made a good point there is that we are really the only entity on Earth that is making art. Although I did see an elephant make a painting one time, but I
You know,
think that
I
was
I
just
was specifically thinking of that when I was saying it. I'm like, "Oh god, I put my foot in my mouth here. I'm
no,
not gonna bring up the elephant."
no, 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 no. It's not. I don't consider that to be art. But anyway,
Well,
so
way to address the elephant in the room,
oh,
Tim.
lovely. We got to add a soundtrack or a rim
Oh,
shot to that one.
yes.
But so failure. Let's. We're all happy now. Let's talk about how we failed.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
well, failure is one of those things where I think there's some people, and I know some of them, they set this unrealistic expectation to I'm not allowed to fail. I have to be perfect. It's a recipe for never-ending frustration. I think life is easier when you accept that despite your best efforts, you're going to make mistakes. Now, okay, that's a fact. That's
Yes.
not up for discussion. But how you respond to that failure is 95% of that mistake. What's your advice when you, on rare occasions, have made a mistake? How do you find is best to respond to it?
First off, I make mistakes all the damn time. It's not rare occasions. I just try to keep them in the realm of mistakes that are easily corrected. um, as far as advice goes, a similar question that I get asked with some frequency is, how do you know a song is done from a writing standpoint, or when is a mix done? How do you know it's time to release it? Um, or how do you feel okay with releasing something if it's still not where you want it? And the answer is the same to your question. And it's, you want to think of everything you do as not just a finished thing you are putting out, but it is there to serve as training for you. And more importantly, the release itself is not, don't think of anything as your magnum opus, or, the the most precious thing you have ever created. You can't be too married to any of this stuff. As weird as sounds to say, because obviously you need to be incredibly emotionally invested in any artistic pursuit for it to be as effective as it's going to be. But if you can think of everything you do artistically as a time capsule, it is a snapshot of you as an artist, as a human being, as someone that has something to convey at that point in your life. And it's representative. It's representative of what you wanted to convey, as well as the tool set and abilities you had with which to convey that at the time. And if you can think of everything as, well, this is just a mile marker and it's not where I'm stopping. And, I will look back at even the things I thought were perfect and find, with fresh hindsight, be able to identify things I would change and all that stuff. Why stress on the front end? You obviously need to put in time to make sure that it's what you want it to be. But there's this kind of slippery slope where it can go from, well, I still need to work on it, to I will now always be working on it because it will never be ready. And that's the point where I think you just need to change the mindset and go, I don't need to work on this until it's perfect. I need to work on it until it's as good as it can be with where I am right now. And that's okay.
You
So,
do
you
you do
know,
kind of have those artists that, and we all can kind of see this image in our head is it's that tortured soul that he just can't ever get that painting right. And he's done it 75 times and he just tears it up and throws it away. No, it's not perfect yet. It's
mhm.
never, I don't think that's an achievable goal. I think that's a negative feed loop that you just
Yeah.
can't get out of.
And it doesn't even guarantee that it's going to do what you want it to either. Like,
Right.
I didn't see the movie, but that what was there was some Scorsese flick that came out recently with Adam Driver that he had spent like years making this thing or something, and it flopped hard. And I mean, that's not. There could be a million reasons why that happened, but regardless, it is an example of a very talented set of creatives that made the decision to take the time to get things exactly where they wanted it to be. And there's a strong argument to be made that that was not the right course of action for that specific piece of art. On the flip side, Black Sabbath needed to have one more song before they released their second album, and they cranked out Paranoid in some disgustingly short amount of time. And it's one of the best heavy metal songs of all time. So I get that it is important to not cut corners and that you don't want to just give up on something because it's not going how you want. That's not what I'm talking about. Um, but recognizing that the amount of effort you put into something doesn't always correlate to its value afterwards. And I use the term value in a very broad sense. But between that and the fact that, you need to put stuff out if you want to put stuff out, you could spend another 6 months working on it and getting it right, or 2 years or something, but A, there's no guarantee you'll feel at that point that it's ready to release yet, and B, that's 6 months or 2 years that you were still working on this thing and not putting it out, taking a bit of downtime, listening to it again, trying to figure out what you did well, what you don't want to do well, learning from it, and going on to the next thing that will be better because you have, you've grown, you've matured as an artist and as a creator of the specific type of work that you want to put into the world.
Do you think that certain people just have an ear or a knack for your line of work? Do you find that a lot of people get into it and then because they romanticize the job and they see themselves working with some legendary band or artist and cranking out a masterpiece. But when it comes down to the day to day or just an ear for it, They don't really have it?
Not so much with what I do, at least not with other people that are doing client work. Um, there are people I know that are, mixing their own recordings. It's just part of their production process. They want to put out songs and they either, want to be mixing it themselves or they can't afford to hire someone else. And there are um, people in that situation that I think just really aren't cutting it. And in a lot of cases, I think it's correctable. One of the other things about this specific line of work is that one of the unfortunate realities is that you do need a certain listening environment and a certain caliber of equipment to be able to work with it. Or else you're just handicapped and it's a huge fight uphill. The analogy I frequently use is like if someone gave you a page out of a coloring book and said, "Hey, color this in," you could make it look as good or as bad with a set of crayons as you could based on your own talent. But you're going to have a much better shot at doing that if you're sitting in a room with white neutral light than if you're sitting in a room with a yellow tinted bulb or, a dark room with just a red light or something. And it's the same with mixing audio. A lot of people that are making music can play an instrument great or can write great music and this, that, and the other, but it's asking a lot to be like, well, now you need to actually set up a whole environment with acoustic treatment and proper monitoring and dedicate it just to that because it's, at least a several $1,000 affair, not to mention that a lot of people can't do it because they're renting or they don't have the space in their house or, this, that, and the other. And unfortunately, that plays into it a lot of the time. A lot of the folks that I see that are struggling with this, it's not because they're not dedicated and it's not because they aren't finding good sources of learning. It's that there's some actual hard limitation. Um,
Yeah.
but on the flip side, there are people that are just naturally great at this. There are people I know that were mixing in in situations that I never would have guessed based on listening to the quality of the music they put out. And then sometimes you talk to them, it's like, yeah, I mixed this in my back room. My dog was snoring the whole time I was recording it. And, the refrigerator was right up and causing all this electrical interference in my monitors. But yeah, it turned out okay. Like there will be people like that, just like
Yeah.
with um, your other person you mentioned that does sharpshooting. I've done target shooting for a number of years, and I'm somewhat okay at it, but it's the result of me putting a lot of time into it.
Hmm.
You do see people where it's like, yeah, I thought I'd get into it, and 2 weeks later, it's apparent that they're just a natural at it.
Sure.
And you can have that with anything, and it's very frustrating. And you quietly wish ill upon them behind their back, but
No, the guy that just he's been shooting for 2 weeks and he throws a golf ball over his head and then shoots it out of a mirror reflection, facing the other way. And it's like, oh, I
yeah,
just picked
Annie
it up.
Oakley.
It's golly, you make me sick.
Yeah, get out of here. I don't want to hear
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Go be
Well,
perfect somewhere else.
I know that's exactly right. So as we come into the home stretch here, the topic that in any interview that I do, folks want to know is about pay. Now, I never ask my guests what they make, but what can you give me any ballpark or kind of explain how someone in your line of work is paid? Is it by project or is it by the hour or both or studio rental time or how does that kind of pan out?
I'm assuming that you want me to exclude the people that wait until we're several conversations in and then they say that they can just pay you in weed, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Because that happens.
I bet it
Um,
does.
it's all over the place and it's compounded in my situation because I'm doing several different disciplines. Mixing engineering is its own thing, mastering engineering is its own thing, and then the voiceover stuff is, even further away. Um, for me, it's funny, I was just talking to someone else about this the other day, but I was reading an interview with a composer a while back that said, never work for free, but that doesn't mean always work for money. There are three reasons to take a
Hmm.
job. One is if it pays well. Two is if it's going to provide you with an experience that will be beneficial for either you, personally or professionally, and you have your baseline covered already. You can afford to take that job. Or 3, you're going to not make anything on the front end, but you know that the exposure, to say the bad E word, is going to be sufficient enough to justify it. And I'm not talking about, yeah, well, my cousin might play this at his party if I do it for free, but like, my understanding is with, oh God, what game was it? It was with Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight was an indie video game that came out, I don't know, around about 10 years ago now, that was just made it huge. And it had a great team behind it. And the composer is this fellow, Jake Kaufman. He goes by Vert. And he actually started in the video game cover scene. For anyone listening, if you want to hear the best the best version of The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past music, go find Vert's Blood of Ganon cover. But anyway, this guy went from doing, that stuff to doing it professionally. And at the point that he was approached by the team from Shovel Knight, it would have been very easy for him to, present them with a number that he would do it for. And when they said, look, we can't afford that, could have been fully justified walking away.
Mm-hmm.
However, he was interested enough in the project and had enough faith in it that he did it. And it's huge. It's had a ton of expansions. It's still frequently talked about and just great situation. So bringing that back, not all of the work I do is for pay. These days, since I've been doing this 15-ish years now, the vast majority is, but there are still times I'll take things on just because I think it's fun, or, there's an opportunity with it, or it's a chance to, work with someone that I haven't, really interacted with before. Anyway, that's just kind of skirting the edges of your question. I tend to do that if you haven't noticed. Got to circle around on it. As far as actual pay, generally I look at each project by itself. With my voiceover stuff, I have most of my pay structure is per finished hour. And it's because I do audio engineering and I have the luxury of being able to, engineer my own narration and stuff. I'm not delivering raw files to clients unless they specifically request that. So it doesn't make as much sense for me to bill it by work hour, because who knows, I could be tripping over weird phrasing and, be adding 5 minutes here and there to the whole project that the client really shouldn't have to pay for. So per finished hour is great. I have something that rolls out at the end to an hour and 15 minutes of finalized audio that they can just drop in their project. That's a great way for them to pay it based on that amount. With musical stuff, it's usually based on the size of the project per song. So, if you have a metal band and you come to me and you're like, hey, we're putting out a 10-song album, what do you think? And I have a base pay per song that I usually go to. And for a larger project like that, since a lot of times in those sorts of things, you can replicate work, from one song to the next, excuse me. Generally, I'm not reworking the drum sound from the bottom up for each song on an album by the same band, So if I get, one song from them, I'll bill the full thing. But if I have an album, with 8 or 10 songs, I can give them a discount because I know it won't be as much work. At the same point, if someone comes to me and they're like, yeah, we've got a 10-song album and it's just 2 guys with acoustic guitars and, someone singing over it, I will probably drop the price of that. On the flip side, if it's, 4 layered rhythm guitars and there's a ton of synths and a full orchestral track and, a 32 layer vocal stack with all this stuff, I'm probably going to charge more in a situation like that. But again, it's based on the project, not necessarily the hours worked. And with these sorts of things, I, allow a certain number of revisions. This is a technical process, but it's also largely a creative process. And you want to account for the fact that however much you and the client talk on the front end about making sure you're both aiming for the right target, there's going to be redirection, and that's just part of it. So there'll, be a fee per project based on that reasoning that I discuss and we come to with the client on the front end. I usually charge half up front, non-refundable, and the rest is paid on delivery. And that has worked really well for me in most situations. So yeah, I mean, it's all over the place. Mastering is different than someone that just wants it mixed. If there's a bunch of editing work that needs to be done, sometimes that'll be a separate fee. I would say the one big lesson about doing this work that I am still having to learn and refine for myself is uh, making sure to try and account for everything up front so you don't end up in a situation that's going to negatively impact what you had promised the client, whether that's the pay rate or the turnaround time or anything like that.
You make a good point early on. You were talking about the different ways, currency doesn't have to just mean dollar bills.
Oh yeah.
There's other ways that you can get something of value, whether it's an experience or exposure, for example, but you probably have to weigh that to go, I'm getting a lot of exposure, but there's no money coming in. So I need to kind of
Yeah.
revamp things.
And it depends on your situation and where you are in your career and stuff. And like, I mean, I'll admit it. I do pretty well with my business. Like if I was just on my own doing this, I would be able to survive just fine. But the fact that my wife has a stable salaried job is really nice because it
Mm,
means that the fluctuations with my ups and downs, I'll have a day where I'll hit her up and be like, "Yeah, a bunch of invoices got paid. I pulled in like $4,500 today or something." But that's obviously not indicative of that doesn't mean I make that money per day. That could be after 3 months of nothing coming in just because I happen to be between deposits and finishing up projects and stuff like that. So, having someone else that has a more stable employment situation, a more traditionally stable employment situation allows me to do this. And it allows me to be more effective at my job too, because I'm not stressing. I'm not trying to rush through things to make sure I can get as much work done as I, need to pull in money, that sort of thing. Um, it's it's just very different for each situation. And it also allows me a bit more latitude to do things that I just think would be fun. Or, if I have a buddy hit me up and he's like, "Hey, I'm putting out this thing and I just don't have any money, but what do you think?" I can potentially look at it and be like, "Yeah, this looks like it's going to kick ass. I totally want to help with this. Yeah, let's just do this for free. And if there's money afterwards, we'll figure it out or something like that."
Does your wife kind of know how things are going? Where if you come in and say we're having ramen for dinner versus we're going out, and yeah, I know guacamole's extra, but whatever my lady wants, she gets, kind of thing. Is that how the?
Leonardo tossing the bills for the guac. Um, yeah, she's I'm extremely lucky with her. She's very open with communication, as am I, and that extends to finances and stuff. We were kind of fortunate in that, we met up later on, in our early mid 30s. And so uh, I think that we both had a chance to, establish how the relationship was going to go as adults, which is nice. And part of that was we just talk about the finances and I let her know where things are and hey, so, things are good right now, or it's going to be fine. I've got this coming in, or yeah, I was expecting this to come in last week, but the person's dragging their heels and it hasn't been the source of contention or arguing for us at all. And I've been very fortunate in that regard. She's a very practical person, and being able to just talk about this stuff is nice. You see memes online, especially in guitar circles, people talking about, oh, I did this and I can't tell the wife for a while or this and that. And
Yeah.
it's great because, like I said, we met through the same scene. Right above me is her office, and she's got a whole wall with just a ton of Castlevania stuff. And
Hmm.
so if I go to video game series, and so if I am talking to her and I'm like, look, I know I shouldn't do it, but there's this guitar I've been looking at that I just can't stop thinking about. She's usually like, well, how unrealistic would it be to do that? And of course, there are times when she's like, maybe we shouldn't do that. But in general, it's just wonderful. And I shudder at the thought of having to do it in a different situation.
It sounds like a healthy level of communication from where I'm sitting, and I commend you for that. I think that's where a lot of relationships break down.
Oh,
But
yeah. Now, keep in mind, it's real easy for me to portray my side of things, but
right.
no, she feels pretty good about it too.
So, one final question, and then we'll wind things up. If you weren't in your current career, if you weren't doing what you do right now, was there one other thing maybe years ago where you thought, I might want to do that? Just something kind of uncharacteristic or just totally out of left field that, wouldn't work in the moment, but yet you always kind of side eyed it a little bit.
I mean, it's hard to say. I was doing this stuff part-time for years, around other jobs before I was able to, kind of step it up to my main gig. And so I've worked in a lot of different types of jobs, public sector, private sector, different shifts, physical things and sedentary things and all that. And none of them were, so objectively good. I wasn't getting paid to test burritos every day or something like that. But I think that this was always what I had in that spot in my mind. Well, if I wasn't, working at this law office, or if I wasn't, doing this records thing or something, yeah, I'd love to work on audio full time. And I was already in my early 30s when this turned into my full-time thing. And at that point, I don't think there was anything else like, I mean, of course, as soon as I started doing this full time, there was the excitement and the fear of like, oh man, this is great. And also, am I going to starve? But by the time that, kind of honeymoon phase faded to the point where it was, just what I was doing, and I potentially could have had something else start growing in my mind as the next, grass is greener sort of thing. I don't know. I still like doing this. I mean, I have frustrations with it. Of course, everyone does with any career, but I there have definitely been times where I'm like, man, I can't wait to be done with this project, or things are, really rocky with this specific client right now. But it's never been to the point of me thinking like, God, I just don't like this. I just wish I was doing something else. Um, and that's good, and
Oh
it
yeah.
it could change with time, but also, I'm a grumpy old person now, and I usually go to sleep at like 9 o'clock and wake up early, and I have my routine, and that makes me happy. So I think I'm less
Hmm.
prone to start dreaming about something else at this
Right.
point.
One question before we wind it up, and I'm just curious: have you ever had anybody come in and your vocal that does vocals, and they sing, and you're just thinking, I'm not going to be able to salvage this. This person has zero talent.
Yes, and
You got to hide your body language, don't you?
no, I was thinking of the best place to go from yes.
Hmm.
um, Singing, yes. Any other instrument or thing like that. I I had a situation a couple of years ago where I had actually traveled out of state to help this band start recording their album. And when I got there, it became very apparent that one of the musicians, though capable, had not been practicing. There were other factors involved too, but the takeaway was that we got set up and we were ready to go, and within a couple hours realized, oh no, like this is just not going to happen. And in a situation like that, it's tough because, you've flown somewhere, there's time booked, there's expectations, and, that's its own thing. In general, I make a point of, most of my stuff is remote. And so when I start talking with someone, as early in the process as I can, I ask them if they would mind if I listen to what they've recorded.
Oh, that's good.
It just makes it better for everyone.
Sure.
And usually in those situations, if you run into, the type of thing where, man, this person just can't play guitar, or, they can't sing, or this, that, and the other, it's no money has changed hands yet, thank God. So
Yeah.
that makes it easier, because I hate having to, change stuff up after that point. But you can address things on a granular level without saying something like, "Yeah, I'd love to work with you, but you can't play guitar." And I mean, really, that's not the case, too. It's not that they can't play guitar; it's that there are these things that are causing problems. And realistically, the fix for those things might be to play guitar for another few years and get better. But I prefer to address that stuff on that granular level and be like, yeah, I love the song. I think it's going to be great. But here's something I was hearing, in the guitar lines, I was noticing that pretty consistently you're coming in before the beat, or when you're doing these bends, it's not quite hitting the note. Um, And then, we'll have the conversation. Like, I could go in and edit that stuff, but it's never going to sound as good or as, honest as if, you know, it was recorded that way. How do you feel about taking a bit of time and trying to retrack some of this stuff? And that's great because it keeps us in the mode of, all right, how do we address this instead of, no, this isn't going to work. And there's some judgment attached to that.
Right.
And, who knows? I'm not, God. This person could have just been having an off day when they recorded the guitar, and yeah, they could retrack it and then send it to me and it's great. Or they could, use it as, we might not do that project right then, but it, could be that one little thing where as they practice over the next few years, they focus on that and get better at it. Or it could make them go, well, yeah, I'm really just not doing this how I want to. And I don't want to put this off. Let me get my buddy, see if he can do the solo for this one. And then, that's a great solution too. Um, so yeah, there are people that are not as good as they want to be for the current project at whatever it is they're doing. But I think that it's frequently possible to turn that into, at the very worst, a neutral thing, if not a positive thing, as opposed to a negative thing. I've worked with people that have submitted stuff to other mixing engineers that have been, one guy in particular, he got back to him and, said, this sounds like you recorded it out, behind your garage. Like, what the hell are you thinking with this? And it's like, dude, even if that is how you feel about this
Yeah, be
stuff, like,
diplomatic about it. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, have some modicum of sense, like,
sure.
and yeah. So there,
Is
yeah.
experience something that, because I can see how if you don't know how to manage the egos and emotions and the wants and the passions that someone coming to you thinking, my mom told me that I can sing really good, and
Mhm.
so I'm going to knock this out of the park. And then, when they say, did I get that note wrong? And yeah, well, you got all the notes wrong. How you deliver that diplomatically and sensitively, and maybe find solutions as opposed to just presenting a failure at their feet.
Yeah. Um, well, first off, I have the luxury of usually not being present when the stuff is
Yeah,
being recorded. So
that's a big one.
yeah, I mean, it's not like I have to make that decision right then of, man, do I just let us keep wasting time on this, or do I, stop things right now and have this difficult conversation with someone?
Yeah.
Um, Outside of that, I try to let I try to convey what I need to in very uh, data driven terms. Like, for example, if someone gave me a recording and the vocal line was just every note was off, you know, I I might approach that on the front end and, based on how the sense I have of the person and how much their ego's wrapped up in things and, this, that, and the other. I might just say, like, look, I think that right now we're not ready to do this, and here's why, but I won't say something like the vocal just sucks or, you're not hitting any notes. You know, I will try and give something more concrete. Like, I've noticed with every time you go above a certain register, we're hearing you slide up into the note and frequently you're overshooting and then coming down to it. And both of those things are really reducing how impactful this could be. Or, if I have a bit of time or if it's someone that I know is going to give me pushback on something, I'll, if it takes me 10 minutes to get the file from them and actually go through and take the first verse and tune it to where it should be, I can then show them, all right, so here's everything I had to do just for this thing, and here's how it sounds as a result of it. And I think it would sound better if we got a recording that didn't require this amount of tuning after the fact.
Hmm.
You see what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
kind of brings them in as a collaborator on how we fix a problem that I, as the professional, have been able to notice while they, not the professional, were unaware of. And that's exactly what they're paying me for. It's to help take what they're doing and make it as impactful as possible. And sometimes that means convincing them that it needs to be redone up to that point already,
Yeah.
And it's their thing, I'm not the grand poobah of what makes music good. And I know a lot of information about things I could argue objectively. But even if someone gives me a vocal line or a guitar part, and in my mind, my first thought is, this is just horrible. It's still a presumptuous thing on my part to just assume that that's not necessarily, at least in part, what they're going for. So that's another reason I try to approach it that way is, if I, show them the amount of auto tuning I had to do and they're like, oh no, I wanted it to sound like Yoko Ono or something,
Oh, good
it's
Lord.
easier. Yeah. But I mean,
What
it's
a
easy.
horrible example.
I mean, hell, it demonstrates what I'm trying to say though, doesn't it? You
Perfect.
immediately knew what I was saying.
That was a visceral reaction. I'm sorry to any Yoko Ono fans out there, but good grief.
I'm not.
Sorry. Oh my goodness.
But still at the same point, it's easier to to salvage things at that point and be like, oh, okay, well, if that's what you're going for, yeah, then we don't need to do any of this.
Right.
It's easier to do that than to be like, oh, well, then I'm sorry I said you sound like a dying wombat or something.
Right.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, you can't de-escalate at that point.
So on the Yoko Ono example, let's go ahead and wind up this conversation. Erik, we've been talking for almost 2 hours, man, and I didn't even realize that it was such an enjoyable conversation. You are chock full of knowledge.
Well, I sure know how to fake it at least, but I'm glad you enjoyed the conversation. I did too. It's nice to get to talk about this stuff.
Hey, if folks want to find you and use your services or reach out to you, where can they find you?
They can go to www.vikingguitar.com. That's VIKINGGUITAR.com. You can also email me at vikingguitarproductions@gmail.com because I still don't have a professional email address for some reason. And I'm also on various social media as Viking Guitar. But yeah, again, just the main things I do primarily for, rock-oriented music, metal and stuff, but I've also done jazz and blues and EDM and rap and trip hop and a bunch of other stuff. But post-production for musical projects, mixing and mastering. I also do a lot of audio processing for independent voiceover artists and podcasts. So if you're looking for anyone to help with that sort of stuff, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to chat about it, even if it ends up being something that would be better suited for someone else. But as you can tell, I like just running my mouth about audio. So give me reasons to talk with you about your audio project.
Erik, thank you so much, man. This has been a blast. I think a lot of folks are they're gonna be able to pull a lot from this if they're interested in your line of work, and hopefully they'll reach out for your services as well.
Well, even if I don't get any leads from this, it's been great talking with you. Like I said, I like talking about this stuff. And for someone that doesn't live in this industry, you've had some really great questions. And
thanks.
It's been a pretty comprehensive approach to this. And I've enjoyed it, Tim.
All right.
I've had a good time.
Tim gets a little wood on the ball every now and again. So,
Today was a win.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.